Hey everybody, I wanted to talk today about strategy, ticker symbol MSTR. I've got a 6-hour drive to Iowa for work here, and I figured I would kind of want to talk about strategy and why I think it's not only one of the most transformational legacy companies that you could buy, but also how I personally plan to use it as a vehicle for early retirement, probably the more important of the two. I think there's a lot of still misunderstanding around the company, around the stock. You know, a lot of people have recently become aware of it because of, several reasons, but how outspoken and vocal Michael Saylor, the CEO, chairman and founder, is on Bitcoin and his presence in the Bitcoin community, and he's doing a fabulous job, being an advocate for it, but also with the recent run-up that it's had over the last couple of years. I mean, it's hilarious. If you take a look at, just the all-time stock price chart for strategy, and you look back, it had this little spike back in the dot-com bubble, and it crashed, and then it's basically been flat for like 30 years until they started acquiring Bitcoin pretty much right after COVID-19 in 2020. So since then, it's been a volatile and rocky road, but has rewarded shareholders handsomely who've been able to get in and hold it. I think that's the hardest thing, actually, is just holding it. The volatility is a beast, and if you're not used to it, if you're not comfortable with it, it's really hard. And whenever I first started buying shares in it, it was a little bit for me. I was used to some of the more volatile stocks like Tesla and Palantir previously, and some of the ones that, some of the hyper growth names, but strategy took it to a new level. But I'm a long-term shareholder. I've held for years now. It's basically been my entire portfolio for 4 years, effectively. And, I think if you have a strong understanding in Bitcoin and you really believe in Bitcoin, and you kind of listen to Michael Saylor and Fong Lee, right, and the management team, and you listen to what they say, and if you believe it, if you agree with them, if you have similar thoughts on Bitcoin, it really is not as risky as maybe people perceive it to be. Bitcoin is the hardest thing on the planet, the hardest monetary system. There's no other asset on the surface of the earth that looks like it, that is as hard as it is, as rare, really, in terms of its new supply. So I mean, Bitcoin really is sound money. It's hard money. It's it's better than gold in every way. It's got many characteristics that are shared with gold that match gold, but it's better than gold in every way. So in my opinion, Bitcoin is the future. I think that we are going through kind of a slow transition from an old monetary policy, an old fiscal system, to a Bitcoin economy. I don't think this is something that's going to take 3 or 5 or 10 years. I think this is decades and decades in front of us, but I do believe that we are transitioning to kind of a sound money, digital money system that is going to be backed by Bitcoin. I think eventually world trade, global trade will be backed or performed in Bitcoin. Countries all around the world, even today they're starting, but countries all around the world are going to be using Bitcoin as a strategic asset in their, as one of the things they hold. You're seeing countless companies now come out in 2025 saying they're putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet. This is only going to continue. This is not going the other way. Like, at this point, the ship has sailed. We're not going back. I think it's pretty obvious, but we're still, I think, not fully understood on what companies that have a Bitcoin treasury actually are, what they're doing. There's a lot of misconception in the market. I think there's a lot of misconception around Bitcoin treasury companies and why they deserve a premium. You're seeing people like Jim Chanos and others who are shorting strategy, buying Bitcoin, right? this trade has been done before, right? And ultimately, it's not going to work out. If a company is able to acquire Bitcoin and increase their per share holdings, their Bitcoin per share, their key metric, Bitcoin yield, if they're able to have a positive Bitcoin yield over time, by definition, you are adding shareholder value. So you deserve a premium for that. Now, it may not be exact 1-to-1 because you don't exactly know how much they're going to generate on a going forward basis. But if a company is able to positively accrete Bitcoin and generate shareholder yield, they should not be trading at par with their Bitcoin holdings. So, if you've got a long-term view on Bitcoin and you believe that Bitcoin is going to grow, its adoption is going to increase, it's going to become more valuable, it's going to take over share or ownership, or maybe that's not the right word, but basically a percentage of various places around the world where assets are held, equities, bonds, right, art, properties. If it's going to basically demonetize those and shift that value, that store of value component over to Bitcoin, then Bitcoin, has got a very long trajectory ahead of it. So, this isn't necessarily meant to be a Bitcoin video. This is more meant to be a strategy, MSTR video, and kind of just explaining why I believe it is a very sound investment, something that I have a lot of faith and conviction in. So my personal plan, if you look at MSTR, is to basically harness the volatility. People have talked about this, covered calls, right? Various option strategies around it. But let's say, you've got 1,000 shares, you've got a decent number, right? If you're selling, you could reference Hermes Lux on X, right? Very famous for kind of the MSTR 10 Delta strategy. That's a very legitimate thing. I think that, there's a lot of misunderstanding around covered calls and around not only how they work, but the tail event that your shares actually get called away. I ultimately, to me, it comes down to probability. I think that there is a chance, of course, that it could happen, but there's a very high likelihood of it not happening every time you enter into one of these contracts. Personally, for me, 10 Delta is actually a little aggressive. As a long-term strategy shareholder, I do not want my shares called away. The best way to not have that happen is to not engage in this. But at the same time, I've got bills, everybody's got bills, you need to be able to pay for your living expenses. So, it's like kind of the classic question, right? Okay, I've got say Bitcoin, or I've got strategy, I've got some asset, I need to live. I don't really want to sell the asset, so what can you do, right? Well, you can take out loans against it, right? You can kind of use it as collateral for things like that. That's not a bad option. I'm open to that. It's not how I would primarily intend to manage my bills and live my life going forward. It's a good supplement, but it would not be how I would primarily tend to kind of run my life. I think a low delta covered call on strategy 30 to 40, 45 days out is an excellent strategy. I personally like the 5 deltas, just because I think that it gives you that little extra cushion in terms of the share price from whatever the market price is to the strike price. It gives you that little extra cushion than a 10 delta. Of course, you're sacrificing premium, but to me, it just makes me feel more comfortable to have that little extra wiggle room. But ultimately, I'm only going to do this, or I would only say to do this on a company that you actually want to own, something you actually have long-term belief and conviction is. I'm not really a fan of swing trading or momentum trading, finding a stock that's pumping, somebody likes, or they're promoting online for whatever reason, or if it's had a recent rally, right, kind of getting into that FOMO. That you can make a lot of money doing that, but what I'm trying to outline here is long-term conviction in Bitcoin, in an equity backed by Bitcoin, largest publicly traded company that owns Bitcoin, that has a moat position that will not be touched, using that as a long-term vehicle for not only wealth creation, but funding your lifestyle, funding your legacy, and ultimately being able to live the life you want, how you want, and enjoy it. Because at the end of the day, time is the most precious resource that you have, that everybody has. And the sooner you can get to a point of financial independence and retire early, I think most people would jump at that opportunity, would like to take advantage of that if possible. It's harder and harder today. Everybody knows inflation is going crazy. Prices are sky high, especially here in the United States. Oh my God, it's crazy. Things are absolutely nuts. And unfortunately, I don't believe that that's slowing down anytime soon. I think that we're kind of in this systemic high inflationary system because of the amount of debt we have, the amount of government spending. If you look at M2, monetary debasement over time, right? I mean, which is really a measure of true inflation in my opinion. We are structurally just going to continue to debase our currency. So the only hedge you actually have is something that cannot be debased, i.e. Bitcoin. But the reality is, we're still living in a fiat denominated system. You can look at, people like Jeff Booth, who are very strong proponents of, kind of stepping outside of the fiat system and moving over to the Bitcoin standard, truly earning, spending, living on Bitcoin, saving on Bitcoin. And I think that that's ultimately the right move. But, it doesn't mean that at the same time, like if your mortgage, your car payment, what are you going to do? Call your car company and say, let me pay in Bitcoin. A lot of people don't accept that yet. So I think that you need to have, in reality today, 2025, you need to have a vehicle, some way of generating fiat, earning fiat, whether it's your job, whether it's an investment strategy. But my goal is to retire early. I want to use strategy as a vehicle to sell low delta covered calls to pay my bills. And I've actually been doing this for a while, but very programmatically and intentionally for the last 3 to 4 months. Kind of done it here and there over the last few years, but I've always gotten a little bit cold feet if the stock starts to move, just because I've not wanted my position to get called away. I've had these shares for years and years. I've got an extremely low cost basis. I've done incredibly well just holding, but at the same time, stocks, any stock really, does not experience parabolic moves that last forever. So, I think that there is an appropriate amount of covered call selling that you can use to fund your lifestyle. I think you have to have realistic expectations with that, even on a highly volatile, highly traded stock like MSTR, where it's easy to get into positions, easy to get out. There's a lot of volume every day, a lot of open interest, right? It's really the perfect candidate for doing this strategy. But even in those types of companies, right, like it's something that you don't want to lose these shares, right? I don't want to give up the opportunity to have this long term. So anyways, I wanted to make a video on it. I personally think it's a good strategy. I think more people should intentionally try to learn how to do this. I think that there's kind of a big gap in education around kind of financials and financial products, and how, what strategies people, you have available to you if you're willing to learn and put in the time and focus to not only acquire the shares, but actually implement something like this. That's really one of the things that I think is a major disadvantage, or kind of gap that most Americans have, most people probably around the world, but especially Americans, if they even have access to a 401k or some sort of basic retirement planning. Very few people dive into options and individual stocks and what makes sense, what doesn't. So I think that hopefully this video has sparked your interest a little bit. I wanted to share what I personally use and have been doing, and my plan is to eventually retire. I'm 37 right now. In reality, I could probably retire in a couple of years if I stay on this road, if Bitcoin continues to appreciate, if strategy follows that. There's no reason I shouldn't be able to retire here in a couple of years. And ultimately, if I can retire in my low to mid 40s, fund all my lifestyle needs, have a couple of strong positions, using covered calls as kind of the basis for income, I'm happy. So anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe. Until next time, thanks.